Hello folks, and welcome to the next part of Project Ensis. Now, as you just saw, I finally have a working CNC again, and it has been such a palaver. Not only going through the additional ball screws and having things that didn't fit, but of course even after you've done that, you have to recalibrate the machine and get it all nicely square and everything, which is a full-on job in on itself. But it has now been done, and we've now cut some pretty cool stuff already. So this, as you will have seen, is some pretty hefty aluminium work, and this is the rear I/O panel. So naturally, with this being a scratch build, I have to go through and do everything from scratch. And I thought, you know, it'd be a bit boring if we just stuck to using the one that comes with the motherboard. And since I've already done one for Aquacurrus, I thought let's just have another go at doing this and try and see if I can improve on some things that I probably should have done on that one. And so this is what I've come up with. It's, instead of using 10mm aluminium, we're using 5mm, which is much quicker to machine but still very, very strong. But what's going to be different about this is instead of being an entire panel by itself, instead it's going to be sandwiched in this stuff, which is 10mm frosted acrylic, and then there's going to have another layer of clear acrylic which goes on top of this, and then a 2mm aluminium blanking plate on the back. Now, why am I using frosted acrylic? Well, aside from, I think, matching up with the components themselves, there's a really handy thing that you can do with this, which is you can feed LEDs down the side and make the whole thing light up. Now, I've done this in previous distro plates, but that's usually where it's stuck. So the problem has been in previous times, I've had to use really large LEDs, and actually the thickness tends to be about 10 or 11mm, which does limit the number of options. Well, for this build I've got some really small ones, so some of them are only 2.5mm wide and the others are about 3.5 to 4, which means that I can actually put LEDs in a single piece of acrylic, and that's exciting. So what I'm going to do is, aside from having the sandwich structure, we're going to have a lot of panels made from frosted acrylic, which is going to basically sit on either side of panels like these ones, which are going to be very much structural. And then we're going to have LEDs that are going to pass through and then all be controlled by the motherboard. So in theory, assuming it all works, we can have some really crazy lighting effects that can go all the way through the distro plates, the panels, the components, and basically have the whole case sort of light up. And I think that should be really exciting, especially with the planned shapes that I've got in mind. But we've obviously got some aluminium done. We now need to get this stuff on the machine and cutting, because then we can have some proper panels to work with. Then after that, we need to take that and glass blast it, because as nice as it looks, it's going to be a little bit busy if we have lots of components like that. So I'm going to be glass blasting it to keep everything nice and homogeneous. And then we're going to put it all together and hopefully it will all fit. So fingers crossed, let's get it on the machine and hope everything works out. Now you have to admit, that is pretty cool, and it should give you a rough idea as to how the rest of the chassis is going to play out, because think about it, most of the panels are going to have this sort of construction. They're either going to have elements of aluminium and frosted acrylic with lights in it, so the whole thing is going to be able to glow and pulse. Should be pretty exciting. Now the thing is, this was not easy to make. Obviously every single piece here was a bit of a challenge in its own regard, but the plastic, funnily enough, was the most difficult, because if you're wondering why this video didn't come out last week, it's because I had to make another one. So this one was actually the first piece that I filmed up fully, and there are a few faults in it, namely to do with this top edge here. So what's on this one is a chamfer. There is no chamfer on here. Now why is that? Well, for a start, I just completely forgot to toolpath it, so that's no good. But that by itself wouldn't have been a big issue because that's only a small aesthetic feature. What is a big issue though is because I forgot the chamfer was there, when I did the 2D contour which goes around the outside to cut the piece out from the larger piece of stock, basically I forgot it was there and it cut all the way along that edge instead of the edge below it. Which basically meant that this whole piece here is 2.5mm shorter than this one. And that's no good, because whilst technically that dimension doesn't matter, it's all arbitrary, there is one issue. I was using that edge for the coordinates, so when I flipped this over like so to machine this big old pocket on the back, yeah, that meant that everything was offset by the same 2.5mm, which is of course no good because it meant that none of these holes line up. So none of these work, and this thing most certainly didn't work. So that was a little bit disappointing when I found that out. Luckily though, I did have enough stock so I can just go and make a new one, and in the process I cleaned up some other things as well. So one thing that wouldn't have been as noticeable in the video here, but is very much noticeable in person, is the surface finish on this part. So I obviously didn't have my machine perfectly trammed at this point, and it's got like this sort of step to it. And that is the mark of having something completely off kilter. So I had to then redo everything. I made some jank setup using my granite surface plate and dial gauges to be able to get it perfectly perpendicular, or at least as perpendicular as I can manage. I managed to get it in within about 0.01mm across the length, which is pretty good. Not much more I can do, just simply moving around the workshop will move it around more than that. So that works for me, and the finish on the new piece is so much better as a result. So going forward, I need to go and check all of my axes and make sure that everything is as flat as I can possibly get it, because that means I'll be able to have much better cuts, faster cuts, and really lovely surface finishes, especially in the aluminium, where some of the steps are a little bit noticeable, but luckily after the media blasting, they all seem to be okay. Now, speaking of the media blasting, I was conflicted with this one because when I took this aluminium part off the mill and before shooting the intro video, I was looking at it thinking, do I even want to? Because it looked so good. In the end, the decision was sort of made for me because actually I found a bunch of scratches on the back and I'd have needed to buff those out somehow. So I thought, you know what, let's just do it. Let's do the proper media blasting, and at the very least that means this would be consistent with this, because this mill finish on the 2mm sheet is nothing like as good as the lovely pre-ground finish you get on this tool plate that I'm using for these parts. But with hindsight, I tell you what, actually the decision was fine. I absolutely love the look of the glass beads. I think it just adds a lovely satin look, and it really matches up beautifully with the frosted acrylic. And obviously this is the same look that I've been using in Aquacurrus, and I think it's going to be just as relevant here, especially since there are so many of these sort of blasted elements on the motherboard as well. Now, speaking of the motherboard, it's always the most amazing feeling when this lines up. So just having all the ports properly line up with the I/O is a serious butt clench moment, because you put it in there and you've got no idea whether or not you've done it right. Even if you do 3D printed templates and things beforehand, once it's machined, you're sort of committed. So it's actually quite difficult to kind of work around that. And I'm very, very pleased that everything lines up. And actually it lines up better than all the ones that I've done before. So I learned a little bit from the last ones, and I've adjusted all my paths and the way that I do it. And I think this one has worked out really well. Now obviously this is only the first panel, so I've got an awful lot more to do, but it is a milestone one, and I think the next one should be the motherboard tray, because in this particular mod it has some pretty substantial stuff in it, namely things like connections for distros, cable management, and of course other parts for mounting the front panels and pumps and all things like that are in that panel. So I think it would make logical sense to do that one next. Now, since I get asked this every single day, I thought I'd just fill you in on what's going on with Aquacurrus as well. So I'm currently waiting on a 3090 Founders Edition card. If you haven't noticed, they're quite thin on the ground, so actually it's pretty difficult to get hold of one. But when I do, I still need the graphics card water block for that, which they're still developing. So that's going to have to wait. I can't do anything about that, it's completely out of my hands at this point. Additionally, that's going to require a new back panel, so I'll have to make a new one of those and design all of that. And then additionally, if you recall from the video, the radiator broke, so I've had to replace that. So I've got a replacement coming in, should be arriving sometime this week, but even then I don't know if it's actually going to work because I'm using a completely different type of radiator. So I'm going to need to do some testing, work out whether or not this thing is going to be possible, and then once I do that, then I can move on and actually put it into the case. But all of this requires a lot of time, and don't forget my machine was broken for an entire month. So that's a lot of stuff which has gotten in the way of the project. It's still happening, it's just going to take a little bit of time because I have to work through a lot of variables. In the meantime, I'm going to be focusing on Ensis here because it's a really good scratch build, and there's going to be a lot of things that are going into this one that are going into Aquacurrus as well. So if you've enjoyed that project, this one should be right up your street as well. Now it goes without saying, the best way to stay up to date with projects like this one is to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Now also you can find us over on Facebook, Instagram, builds.gg and Twitter. We've also got our Discord server linked below, which is a great place to have a chat and show us your projects as well. And also if you'd like to support the channel, don't forget to pop by our merchandise store, also linked below, and see if anything strikes your fancy. Take care folks, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.